This video is brought to you by Sayorite. Visit Sayorite.com for all your project supplies, tools, and instructions. Learn how to sew round tubular ends on covers and bags. In this video, we'll be sewing up a round tubular cone that will be used on a wood pellet grill. This will be installed to the cover for the location of the chimney. This tubular cover will be made with a base that can easily be sewn to our cover after it's constructed. To begin, we'll take some measurements from the wood pellet grill's chimney. To make this, we're going to measure the height of the chimney all the way to the top to the bottom. For the circle measurement, we will measure the largest diameter of the chimney. For us, that's the cap. So the diameter for us is 6 inches. Our height is 12 inches, and we need to add 1 inch for seam allowance. For the diameter, we will add 1 inch, then multiply by pi, and add 1 more inch. The result of these two calculations will be the cut size of our tubular section, which is often a rectangular shape. Here, we are using a rotary cutter, a cutting mat, and a clear acrylic ruler to cut our fabric to size. Now that rectangle has been folded in half, outside surfaces are facing each other, and we will sew down the 13-inch side for us, reversing at the beginning and the end to lock our stitch in place. This stitch is a ½ inch away from the two matched up raw edges. This creates a cylinder shape. Sewing a top stitch is not required, but we've decided to do so here. You may be asking, how can I sew a top stitch on the inside of a tubular shaped panel of fabric? Well, if it's large enough, it is possible. Watch how we do it. This top stitch should be sewn to the outside surface of the fabric, and we need to make sure we're sewing through the ½ inch tail on the underside of the fabric. That stitch is about an 1/8 inch away from the splayed out portion of the fabric. You'll notice as I'm sewing, I'm splaying the fabric, pulling it both left and right so that it is splayed open on that first stitch that we created. And I'm moving very slowly and moving the excess tubular fabric out of the way of where the sewing machine will sew. So basically clearing a path that is about 2 inches before reaching the presser foot. And at the end, in the beginning, we do some reversing to lock the stitch in place. For your reference, this stitch is called a semi-flat-felled seam. On the underside of the fabric, you can see we sewed through the ½ inch tail. Calculations for the circular top, cutting it out, and sewing it to the body is next. Now we'll take our tubular body and lay it flat and measure the end where the circle will be sewn onto the top. We measure it totally flat from edge to edge, and ours is 11 inches. We will take that measurement, multiply it by 2, and then divide it by pi, and then add 1 inch for seam allowance. And that is the diameter of the circle that we need to cut out of our fabric. We'll be using the Sayorite canvas patterning ruler. We place an awl in the point where we use it as a compass, and then we place our marking pencil at the 4-inch location to draw our 8-inch diameter circle. If you don't have the Sayorite canvas patterning ruler, you can use a compass or you can use a string with a pencil tied onto it to make this circle. Now we'll cut the circle out. Next, we'll be sewing this round top to the tubular body, but before we do that, we want to place match-up marks on the round top. So we fold it directly in half, and we cut small triangular notches going no deeper than 1/4 inch into each one of the fold locations. Then we will fold it directly in the opposite direction and do the same thing. This puts match-up marks at north, south, east, and west on our round circle. These match-up marks will help us when we're sewing the top to the tubular body, and that we can make sure that it's being sewn on consistently, because we're going to put those marks also on the tubular body. Now we'll lay that tubular body perfectly flat. We've laid it on that one seam that we sewed, and we create match-up marks on it at each one of the folded corners. Then we'll fold it in half the opposite direction, making sure the match-up marks are directly on top of each other, and create match-up marks at those opposite folds. Again, at north, east, west, and south. Now we can take this over to the sewing machine, and we want outside surfaces to be facing each other. So we take the round top and place it inside the tubular body. We'll make sure one of the match-up marks on the round top matches up with one of the matchup marks on the tubular body. And we want to sew this stitch a ½ inch away from the raw edge of the fabric. The Sayrite Ultrafeed LS1 sewing machine and LSZ1 sewing machine has a needle plate with a ½ inch marked on it. So all we have to do is just keep the raw edges up against that needle plate, and that ensures that our stitch is a ½ inch away from the raw edge of the fabric as we sew. Sewing this assembly together is relatively easy if you go slow. Notice the tubular body is just being fed in straight into the presser foot, while the round top is being moved over so that the raw edges match up as you are sewing. So basically you sew an inch or two and stop and make adjustments if required. You also need to make sure that the fabric is laying flat at the front of the presser foot as you sew. If you need to make more major adjustments, do as we just did there. We buried the needle, we lifted our presser foot, made adjustments, and then continued to sew. Those matchup marks should be directly on top of each other as you sew this assembly together. The idea of those matchup marks are, if they are not, what you can do is you can pull or you can push one fabric in faster than the other as it is being sewn. But you have to be careful. You can't do that in an aggressive manner, or you may get wrinkles. Notice this one's a little bit off. So what we'll do is we'll pull and prevent the round tubular top from feeding in as fast as the bottom one slightly. Now, though they are off by about 1/8 of an inch or so, typically that is not a big deal. If they're off more, you may have to recalculate and make sure that your calculations are correct. There is a little bit of shrinkage that happens as you sew. That's normal for any application, but for the most part, those matchup marks are made so that you can make adjustments as you are sewing if required. Here we are coming to the end of our sewing, and you'll notice that the round body has a little bit of extra fabric, whereas compared to the round top. So we're going to have a slight little wrinkle in there because of that excess fabric. What we do here at the end is we reverse over top of our previous stitches that started this assembly. But that little wrinkle will not be very visible. In fact, it'll almost be invisible. So when we inspect our stitches, you'll see a few little wrinkles, and that's because sewing a tubular body with a round top always results in a few wrinkles because the fabric has to shrink and stretch a little bit. But when we turn the assembly right side out, you'll notice that that wrinkle is really not visible, and the assembly looks great. Now, I do not recommend sewing a top stitch on a round top on a tubular body. It's just very difficult to do. So this will be the only stitch in this. Instead of sewing this directly to our application, we will fashion a base and sew it to that first. Then we will sew the base to our project. The smaller base is easier to sew the tubular cover to, and then the base is easy to sew to the cover after it is done. The base needs to have a circle in the center, so we will need to measure the open end of our tubular body. Ours measures a little bit more than 11 inches on this end, 11 1/4. Because we'll be sewing this onto fabric, we need to change our calculation a little bit here. We need to take that measurement times 2, divide it by pi, and now we need to subtract an inch instead of adding an inch. For us, that's 6.16, the diameter of the circle. We need to divide that by 2 so we can draw our circle with the Sayrite canvas patterning ruler. Now you can sew this tubular assembly directly onto your cover or bag or whatever you're making, but I find it easier to sew it onto a square piece of fabric and then sew that square piece of fabric with the tubular cone already sewn to it to the cover. This circle is placed right in the center of our square piece of fabric that we will eventually sew into our cover. The Sayrite canvas patterning ruler is engineered to draw at 1/4 inch intervals. Our measurement is 3 5/64 inch, so we will improvise to make our circle that we drew at 3 1/4 inches slightly smaller. To make the circle smaller, we'll just measure over, place a few marks, and then cut along those marks, making our circle smaller to 3 5/64 for us. Now we'll simply cut out that circle from the center of our square piece of fabric. As we did previously with the matchup marks, we will do the same thing with this assembly. We will fold it directly in half and cut triangular matchup marks going no deeper than 1/4 inch inside the edge of our circle that we just cut out of our square piece of fabric. When it's folded in the opposite direction, just make sure the matchup marks are directly on top of each other that you made previously. This creates matchup marks at north, south, east, and west, just like we did on the circular top and the tubular body. We did not show placing matchup marks on the bottom edge of our tubular assembly. We've already done that. To do it appropriately, make sure the tubular body is turned right side out. Then slide the square with hole in the center under the tube so its outside surface is facing against the outside surface of the tube, as seen here. Notice now that we flip the square with the circle over the tube while holding the edge of both assemblies together. So now the tube is in the center of the circle that we cut out. And where we are holding it with our fingers, the outside surfaces are facing each other. Now we can take this over to the sewing machine and sew these two assemblies together. We will sew this together again using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and we will make sure our matchup marks are directly on top of each other. So again, those matchup marks will ensure we are sewing both the square with the circle and the tubular assembly on at a consistent rate. If while you're sewing the matchup marks are off, you can hopefully pull or push a layer more than the other so that they match up as you sew to the next matchup mark. Again, you want to sew this nice and slow. Our tubular assembly is inside of our circle. The outside surfaces of the fabric assembly are facing each other, and we are sewing a 1/2 inch from the raw edges of the fabric, matching up the edges as we sew around the assembly. Here, our matchup mark is almost perfect. That's what we want. As you sew, make sure that there are no wrinkles in the area that is being sewn. So make sure it's nice and flat. That's why we're only sewing about 1 inch or 2 and then stopping to make adjustments. This is a fairly tedious process, but the circle's not that big, so it only takes a couple of minutes. But again, do take your time. Don't rush this. Otherwise, you'll have to rip stitches. And again, make sure the fabric is flat as it enters the area where it will be sewn. So that's why we're using our finger there to make sure that the fabric is nice and flat as it is being sewn. Matchup marks are still matching up perfectly as we sew around the perimeter of this tubular assembly. That's perfect. We're going to show all of this mainly just because it can sometimes be difficult for people, and we want to try to be as thorough as possible. The Sayrite Ultrafeed LS1 and the Sayrite Ultrafeed LS-Z1 sewing machine has a needle plate with markings that indicate how far you're sewing away from the needle. We are keeping the edge of the fabric on that mark on the needle plate, which is a 1/2 inch away from the needle. So our stitch should be very accurate. You can use a magnetic guide, but it often gets in the way when you're sewing an assembly as difficult as this. So we don't really recommend the magnetic guide when sewing tubular assemblies like this. But the magnetic guide is definitely a must for most sewing applications. So again, not that we're using it for this one, but for other applications, it is highly recommended. Notice that we use our fingers sometimes just by rubbing it over the fabric to be assured that we are not sewing any wrinkles into the area that we are going to be sewing. You can usually feel wrinkles through the layers of fabric with your fingers. Here we are coming to the end where we will do some reversing just like we did when we started sewing to lock our stitch in place. And this completes sewing the assembly to the square with the hole in the center. Now sewing a top stitch onto this is not that difficult, so we will show that next. Notice there are no wrinkles in the assembly. Perfectly good job, and here's what the outside surface looks like. But before we're finished here, let's sew a top stitch around that assembly. This is an optional step. So the top stitch is being sewn into the tubular assembly, so the half-inch tail on the underside is folded to the left. So in other words, we're sewing through the half-inch tail to complete this top stitch. This stitch is actually called a semi-flat felled seam. We discussed that earlier on. We started sewing where the tubular assembly was sewn together, did some reversing there, and we'll sew around the entire perimeter like this. Be sure the fabric is laying nice and flat as you sew it. So even though this assembly has a lot of shape, which will cause wrinkles, we want to try to ensure that those wrinkles are removed as we sew these two assemblies together. So we are splaying the assembly apart on that first stitch that we made, trying to reduce the wrinkles to a minimum and sewing an inch or two and then stopping to readjust. We'll do this all around the perimeter, sewing the top stitch to this assembly. Let's skip ahead and show sewing the end where we started sewing. And here, when we sew over our first stitches, we'll do some reversing, and that completes our stitch. So this assembly is now sewn together. It's ready now to be installed to our cover or bag or whatever you're applying it to. For us, this is a chimney for a wood pellet grill. We will not be putting it on our cover because our wood pellet grill doesn't have a chimney, but we're going to show a mock-up of how it would be done on some scrap fabric. That's next. We will not be sewing this to the grill cover, but actually just a scrap piece of fabric to show how it's done. First, we will take that square bottom piece on the underside and apply double-sided tape to all four sides of the square. This is the base of our tubular assembly that we just made. Then we will peel off the transfer paper, revealing the glue, and we will create a 1-inch hem on each of the four sides. The double-sided tape will help hold the hem in place so we can take it directly to the sewing machine and sew it. Now we'll be basting this to the top or outside surface of our application, and we will discuss why we do that a little bit later on in the video. Some of you may say, well, that will allow water to seep into the edges of this assembly that we'll be sewing on. But if you do it so that it's on the underside of your cover or application, water can seep in at the bottom edge as well. We'll discuss that a little bit later on. After the single hem, which is about 1 inch, is created, we will apply seam stick basting tape for canvas, part number 129, on top of that, very close to the edge of that hem. We want to keep that basting tape about a 1/16 inch away from the edge because we want to sew through the basting tape to help make it water resistant. We placed an X on our fabric to represent where our obstacle, for us on a wood pellet grill, this would be the chimney, and then now we measure the base of our square after the 1-inch hem, and we will ensure that we place marks that would place that star in the center so we can center our tubular assembly directly on top of the location where we believe the chimney would come through. We'll peel off the transfer paper, revealing the glue, and then we will carefully baste it on top of the marks that we made with the chalk pencil cartridge set. I like basting this assembly down before I cut the hole for our obstacle, in this case a chimney on a grill, to protrude through the cover. That way I don't have to worry about the fabric on the bottom side having more wrinkles or having spots that aren't necessarily laying flat due to the hole that I've created. So we'll cut the hole after we have it sewn in place. Then we will sew around the perimeter, starting at one of the corners and doing some reversing to lock our stitch in place. When we reach a corner, we will bury our needle where we want to pivot and make the 90-degree turn, and then we will raise our presser foot, rotate our assembly, lower our presser foot, and continue to sew. We'll do this around the entire perimeter. We want to try to keep that stitch about an 1/8 inch away from the folded edge, and we do some reversing at the end. Now, if this were the high side, this is where water will gather, but the double-sided tape will help it from wicking through. And let's say that you sewed this base to the underside of your cover. Then you'd have a problem down here because you'd have a hem there. So it doesn't really matter whether it's on the outside or the underside, but it is easier to install it on the outside as we've done in this video. Then once you're done installing it, you can just simply cut around the opening where your object will protrude. Now you can cut all the way to your stitches, keeping at least an inch away from your stitches if you like, or you can just cut so that in our situation the chimney could come through our cover. And there's our sample piece of how you would sew on a tubular cone for a chimney in a wood pellet grill. Coming up is the materials list and the tools that we used to make this wood pellet grill chimney cover. Sayrite carries many outdoor fabrics that are great for covers like this. In this video we used what's called Odyssey fabric. If you're watching this video on YouTube, you'll find links to the materials and tools that we used in this video in the description below. For more free videos like this, be sure to subscribe to the Sayrite YouTube channel or visit the Sayrite website. When you subscribe to the YouTube channel, don't forget to click the bell to be notified of new videos when they become available. I'm Eric Grant, and from all of us here at Sayrite, thanks for watching.